Here. Yes, we're recording in progress now. All right. I am going to go ahead and do roll call, and I think we're going to go ahead and did we decide we're going to pass on the minutes, Trace, till the next round? Okay.
Yeah, we sent them out so late, so we'll just do a slate of approvals next meeting, just so everyone knows.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Roll call. Don Alexander. Yolanda.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning. Kevin Bishop.
Sure, and I'm not sure where.
Was that didn't relate to Kevin, right? Okay. Sam.
Here.
Good morning, Sam. Carlos.
Good morning.
Good to see you, Carlos. Ashley Chase.
Here.
Hello. Jill Cohen.
Here, good morning.
Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning.
Good morning. Jessica Daughter I saw her in the chat and she is here, but I think on a phone.
I'm here. Yep. Just listening in today since I'm kind of like moving around and I'll be at the Capitol.
Fantastic.
Not on that bill. Not on that bill.
Not on that bill. Smart woman. Okay. Ida.
Good morning, I'm here.
Good morning. My friend Jennifer Isle. I saw you. Great. Leanna.
Good morning. Sorry about that.
Leanna.
Good morning. I'm here.
Okay. Hello. Zane.
Good morning.
Hello. Nate Halpern. Adriana.
Good morning, hi.
I welcome Lori. Let's see. Gina.
Good morning.
Good morning. Shauna.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi. Chris Menz, I believe, is going to be here second half. Is that correct?
Right here now, and then I'll leave probably and hopefully come back.
Great. Good to see you. Michelle Murphy, I think also will be here delayed status. Margaret.
Good morning.
Good morning, Margaret. Sarah.
Here.
Hi. Rashawn.
Good morning.
Good morning. Casey. Kathy Wells.
Good morning.
Hello. My friend Donna Wilson.
Good morning. How you doing?
Hi, good. Kelsey is not going to be with us today, and that leaves Jade.
Here. Good morning.
And thank you, and Aletha.
Present.
Hello, welcome. And I think that is my job is done here, Trace. It's back to you.
It is. Good morning, everyone. Excited to be here today. We just saw you last week, so back so soon. Thanks for being here. And I know there are some folks that weren't here last week that are here this week, so want to make sure that I kind of get us at the right altitude, and then we're going to really spend the full 2 hours working through these recommendations that Jordan and Brian have pretty much drafted. We want your feedback, and then we're gonna move on today from this topic. So I want to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen and just remind us kind of where we've been and where we're headed. I think hopefully this will be helpful to the folks that weren't here. We've had a lot of conversations around alternative processes and services, a lot of surveys, a lot of conversations, a lot of feedback. So I think we're in a pretty good spot today to really talk through what's shaping up into some draft recommendations that then you'll come back to when we get to towards the final report where we're actually going to vote on a slate of recommendations. But we want to make sure we're getting right on the language. So today is really going to wrap up that conversation, and then looking ahead, as a reminder to folks, we're going to be dividing into two subcommittees to address the 16 directives we've yet to complete. So we've got we got a lot ahead of us, but we also have a really strong roadmap, I think, that'll get us there. Going to go on to the next page. So we're going to do it in two phases. Phase one, the two subcommittees will be training subcommittee and reporting process subcommittee. So we just took directives that kind of fit into those topics and put them below. We'll have folks select in and a combination of voluntel as needed. And then once we wrap that phase one up, we'll go into phase two, where the two subcommittees will then be specialized occupation subcommittee and data subcommittee. And that will get us right up into where we need to go to produce the report. So just want to make sure that folks don't have any questions regarding the roadmap piece. Any questions, thoughts, concerns? Cool. We're excited to spend the summer together. Can't wait. All right, great. Okay, so today we're really honing in on these recommendations. I'm curious if folks have had an opportunity to review what I sent at 6 o'clock last night. Okay, so here's what I'm going to recommend. I know that some people do not love, I don't love it, to look at a document for the first time and then be talking about it simultaneously. So I didn't actually say this to the team this morning, but I'm just now realizing we need to give some time to folks just to read it. And then we're going to go through the discussion. So here's what I want to do. I'm curious, Brian, since you were one of the ones that created it, how many minutes might you think the average reader needs to read through? Was 8.5? You tell me.
I was gonna say like 5.
Okay, let's meet in the middle. We'll do 6. How about that? All right, so Brian's going to drop in the link in the chat. This is the link that was also shared with you all via email, but if it's easier, it's in the email right now. Pull that up. Let's take 6 minutes to review this, and then we're going to come back for a discussion around each of these recommendation pieces, and I want to do some level setting as far as the altitude that we're going to be kind of working on, but I hope this will be helpful for your kind of context. So 6 minutes, come back on screen, feel free to go off video, and we will come back at 8:17. All right, do folks need more time or are we good? Good to go, good to go. All right, great. All right. So a little keep your, I was trying to figure out if we should put these on the screen. It's hard, obviously, in person versus online. I think let's just commit to everybody keeping their document up. I think it's gonna be easier so you can kind of jump around at your own leisure and you're not having to follow my screen. We might be at different pace. I just want to do a little bit of level setting. So we're looking at these recommendations, and I think Doris and I's job is to just make sure that we're at the right altitude of what we're recommending, because we know that once these recommendations go to the legislature, they will then go through a, legislative process, and there will be a number of folks that aren't at this table today that would need to be at the table for certain decision-making elements. And we know that this group is full of a lot of expertise, and so we want to make sure that we're capturing that expertise in a way that these are meaningful recommendations, and we're not just sending something that's like, yeah, make a decision tool. Now y'all go figure out how to do that. So we're kind of towing the line of level of detail to make these meaningful, but also not getting too in the weeds, recognizing that some of that work needs to happen in the next step once this goes to the legislature. So just want to name that to you all. If we jump in and try to guide the conversation or say, let's zoom out a little bit. That's why, because we want to make sure that we're really capturing the right level of conversation here to get these recommendations really where they need to be. So with that said, we've got about 30 minutes for each recommendation. We might not need all of that, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. I'm going to run through the first one on the decision supporting tools. Doris will then go through consultations, and then I'll come back for warm lines. So everybody was able to access the document, looks like. All right, so that's what I'm going to be working from. So really what we're honing in on are two things. One, if there is something glaring, so I'm thinking about the decision. So if you're looking at the document, decision supporting tools, I'm putting in the language that I'm considering the recommendation, and then we have these supplemental pieces. So I want to make sure there's nothing glaring in the language, and that this feels like we've captured all of the elements that the group has kind of talked about, coalesced around, etc. So the language that I'm referencing in the chat, the task force recommends contracting with a third party to create a decision supporting tool. This tool will aid mandatory reporters in deciding if a concern they have meets the threshold required to prompt a report of suspected child abuse and or neglect. So I want to open it up. When you look at these supplemental bullets here, let's go to the first one. So the task force recommends that the decision supporting tool created by the contracted third party similarly includes the following: ease of use and user-friendly interface, direct referrals to and clarifications of state law, use of clear language rather than legal terminology for greater understanding, incorporation of implicit bias considerations, and the provision of resources and links to agencies, services, and or entities who may help resolve problem if report is not recommended. I'm going to pause there, ask for discussion just on this point. Ashley, go ahead and kick us off. You're on mute. Someone had to do it. It was you.
I think I might have been off mute and hit mute to start.
Right.
Anyway,
nice.
Mine is not about the first bullet. It's about backing up even more. I am not 100% sold that we need a third party to create this particular tool, because I think it makes sense in the later one. There's two different recommendations of the third party. This reminds me of the work on the Family First Prevention Services Act implementation group, where a small, nimble group was able to create, it was a bench guard in that case, but like create a resource and then bring it to another group to like flesh out. But it just seems like that's just not what I'm totally convinced we need a third party. And I say that because I think it adds a level of expense and things like that. So I don't know if we want to talk about that or not, but one of the things that would matter if we were going to talk about it is if this group would be in existence to come back to get feedback. Because I think that's and if this group isn't in existence, then that might lend toward needing it. But I just wanted to maybe have a small discussion first about whether or not we think a third party needs to do this piece.
Totally fair question. Sorry, I didn't I think it's a great question. So what do folks think? Let's hone in on that for a minute. The third party. Now there is a way to write a recommendation where that is then considered down the line as far as like, again, having more decision makers at the table. But I think we need to be able to capture kind of what y'all are wrestling with if that's necessary or not. So what do folks think? Do they agree with Ashley? You see it differently? Want to hear additional comments. And Margaret, I don't know if you want to chime in on that particular point.
I can chime in on that additional point, but I'm a slow processor and it takes me a week and a half to come up with a good idea on my best days. So in response to that recent comment, I think that the language we craft could be broad enough that it encompasses both, either contracting with a third party or using our own experts within our purview on this task force, or however they exist in the state, to create a working group, something like that. So that's my immediate reaction to it was Ashley, right? To Ashley's point. And then secondly, go ahead, Trace.
Well, I was just going to say, is that if you were going to respond to the first bullet, can we stop just on this piece?
Yes, I will
okay.
Stop there. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. I'll come back to you once we get back to the bullet.
Yeah, because I have a comment on the bullet too.
Okay, great. So sticking there, I think about needing to discuss how much a tool would cost before you could vote on that. I do think that that in the report, that is where we would say that we recognize the cost challenges. And so if it is financially advantageous to develop this tool and a third party is necessary, however, to first look at this more nimble group that Ashley's referencing, and that we could write a recommendation that kind of I think it was, I'm not sure who just said that, but that it could be broad enough that we could capture the nuances of that, but also the need for the tool is the recommendation, right? And so that the how then comes secondary based on the cost analysis, which could go through the fiscal note analysis process on the legislative side. So Donna, go ahead, jump in.
So I'll start with this first recommendation, but I think this is true for all of the recommendations.
Sure.
My understanding from when we first joined this task force was that the intent and the purpose was really to focus on eliminating or mitigating disparate outcomes for children and families of color. None of these recommendations hit anything on equity, including this one. So if we're using a third party, how are we making sure that they are doing all the work and supporting decision-making through a lens of equity? It's missing. We missed the mark.
So Donna, I just want to make sure I'm understanding. Are you suggesting then that additional to the language here, that there's an explicit call out that any third?
Yeah. Because if we don't call it out, what gets measured gets done. And if we don't call it out, if we're not explicit, we're going to lose it.
Right. No, I really appreciate that. I think that's exactly why we're doing this conversation. So the language is missing, that the call out for these tools to be equitable, that if, for instance, if we go, let's say that it was going as written, the third party piece, that the piece there would be a organization or a third party that is first and foremost centered on an equity driven decision making tool. Is that kind of what you're getting at as far as the language is missing that specific call out?
Yeah. And so we just have to be intentional in our recommendation.
Yep.
So as legislators are seeing this, it's in the forefront of their mind, so that they are looking for the right tool, the right person, the right resource, all with equity embedded from the beginning.
Yeah. Don, I really appreciate that. I think it's a great point, calling us back to our original mission and saying, does that live and breathe in all of our language? And it doesn't right now. And so we will add that in, I think at a variety of levels, kind of as you mentioned, it needs to be in each of the recommendation pieces. So appreciate that. The other way that we could, well, I think as we start shaping up the report is obviously that will be named at the outset too. And so at what level does that live in each of these recommendations? But I kind of hear like the need that our legislators always reading the intros to each of these reports, and we need to make sure that it's also reflected in the recommendation itself and not just in some like blurb that says, and don't forget equity. Is that kind of, Donna, it sounds like you would like to see language in the specific recommendations themselves. Is that?
Yeah, it can't be an afterthought. Again, the reason why this committee was formed, like that should be in the forefront of all of our conversations, all of our recommendations, all of the language that's coming out of our mouth. It should be centered around, not added at the end, not, you know, just an afterthought. Oh, and by the way, make sure all this is done through a lens of equity. No, that's not how it works.
Right. All right. Well, appreciate that, Donna. Jennifer, go ahead and jump in.
I'm going to kind of build on that in that one of the reasons that several of us are part of this is a focus on survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, human trafficking, and expertise in that area is not a given in the child welfare system or in those with expertise in child welfare. So in addition to the equity piece, I think we're missing, first of all, you know, Margaret Ochoa said to me yesterday, I'm like a dog with a bone with this issue, but it's a good thing, right, Margaret? For one, you know, because we have not yet talked about who are mandatory reporters and should victim advocates be mandatory reporters, except when we keep bringing it up in these conversations, there's that piece of this. But then there's also when another mandatory reporter in a very different field calls or uses this decision tree, are they going to get what they need in terms of determining in this particular circumstance of domestic violence, is a report required? So I just feel like there needs to be a lot more fleshing out of that.
Yeah. So Jennifer, I'm seeing a call out on the last line for
sexual abuse.
And so I'm wondering if it's just it's an addition making, and I know that this isn't the only topic, so other people might have more additions, but that there are additional call outs as far as like the tools being created and having a lens of specialties around certain areas. And it sounds like we're missing the domestic violence piece. And I know that there might be more. So can we, when we get through the bullets, can you come back to that and let's do some suggestions, making sure that we're capturing that at a level that you're comfortable? Okay. So I'm going to go back up to the top. I want to be able to move us through. So in the initial recommendation, so before we get back to the bullets, I hear you all on the fiscal analysis piece, and we also know that we are limited in time. And so we do not have time to do all the financial modeling. And I would just say from, and Jordan and Brian and Stephanie, jump in if you see this differently. I believe that the recommendation could be written in a way where we capture, one, that this tool needs to be created. That's the recommendation, right? First and foremost. Two, that the group has discussed the challenges around this being created via third party and or, you know, an internal, I'm not going to massage the language right now, but, you know, Ashley's a version of kind of what you suggested. The challenges with that decision are around the fiscal piece. And so through fiscal analysis, this group would recommend that if there were any sort of barriers around the fiscal piece, that this is possible to do at an internal level. However, if it's deemed necessary to do through a third party and the funds are, you know, available, for instance, that this group, that the first and foremost, that the priority is that this tool is created. Now, whether it goes through one or the other is something that I think could be happening on the fiscal note analysis side. That would be my, and again, with additional conversation of where this lives, et cetera. So Stephanie, I kind of want to pick on you actually, just make sure that you kind of see that as we're wrestling with like the legislative side of things. Like, are we capturing that right?
Yeah, I mean, I actually just wrote a comment in the chat because I think Ashley summarized it really well. And I think it's an and both. The reality is fiscal modeling today is going to be good for about 8 weeks, right? Until the next forecast comes along, right? We receive quarterly forecasts based on tax revenue, based on how many people move into this, right? All of that. So the truth is there isn't a it's a moving target. I guess is my point. And so to the extent that, you know, the state has ever done business, people put forth ideas, and to Ashley's point, they find money. I think that we're not asking to build highways, right? It's not, we don't need $80 million, to be honest, for a project like this. I don't think I ever asked the company who does this just to get a bid, but you know, yeah, it's probably a few $100,000, right? But so I just think that it's important that it's an and both. Let's talk about it. Let's be clear that it's an investment in our kids and our families, and we want the legislature to invest. And we're not building new cities either, right? And I think, frankly, you know, when I always talk about budgets being moral documents. And we're talking, you know, to Donna's point, a lot of these tools are designed to mitigate some of these disproportionate impacts that we see. And if that is not a commitment the state wants to make, right, we need to have that conversation. So I don't want to stop before we start.
Yep. Yeah, and I'm seeing, Jade, actually, you're kind of going right in the direction where I was, which is the recommendation dials in a little bit more on just the tool itself being created, like that this group is recommending this tool is created, and that the sub bullet, so that we can provide a little bit more of that nuance in the language, captures this kind of fiscal piece and where the group really wrestled. And so I think that can be I think that's great. Jennifer, and then Ashley, and then I want to move us through each of the points. Go ahead, Jennifer.
You coming back to me on this? Were you calling on someone else? Oh, my hand's just still up. Sorry, Trace.
Oh, your hand's still up. Okay, cool. No, all good. All right, all right. All right, lower the hand, and then okay, perfect. There we go. All right, Ashley, go ahead, and then I'm gonna move us into these sub bullets.
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear. Fiscal piece was only one part of me thinking I was unsure about the third party, and I just want to be clear about that, because I do think this recommendation just might benefit from having a small, nimble group of practitioners with really practical experience, and to Donna's point, like some experience with advancing equity, especially if you had a third party doing your other one and one's delaying the other, or you have two different third parties working on tools that are related but different. So it's about more than just finances, and we don't need to get into the details because that's a level I think we can figure out later. But I just wanted to be clear that finances is part of it, but I also think it might just work better the other way. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I think it's something to consider as they look at the recommendation later.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, that's helpful to understand, and I'm seeing head nods too. So the fiscal is one piece, but kind of the wrestling of you know, third party or not. Okay, so let's get back into the document. So looking at the first sub bullet, so again, whether third party or whether this nimble group, we're going to call them nimble group. Ashley, I'm going to use your language. That's the official name, the nimble group. And then Donna, your piece around, you know, explicitly calling out the equity piece. If those two are true, and when we go back, what else here? And I do see the incorporation of implicit bias considerations, but again, it's kind of like, it's like tucked in there, right? And so I hear you on that. And how can we elevate that into a more, you know, explicit piece that this actually like leads the entire piece of this tool? So with that said, if those things are true, what else here do you want to, anything you want to call out before we move to the second bullet? Jennifer.
I'm going to dog with a bone again and just say, I worry about all of the very mandatory reporters that are on our very long list of mandatory reporters. And again, I like to use veterinarians as an example. You know, we're taking people for whom this is not their everyday work. Their work is not the welfare of children and families, and saying, now you're going to use this tool and you're going to go through this whole process and you're going to take all these extra steps. I just want to be mindful of that as we're thinking about what we're building in here, because I think in a lot of situations, this is great, but there are going to be situations where this is adding a burden to someone for whom this is already a complicated burden.
Yeah, and Jennifer, I think so with that lens in mind, I think that's kind of what this point of this bullet is, which is, for instance, the use of clear language rather than legal terminology for greater understanding, the ease of use and user-friendly interface. So is there something, so with your thinking in mind, is there something in this bullet list that is missing as it relates to ensuring that folks where this is not their entire job that you feel like is missing from this list as far as like user friendliness and ability to so think about that for a second. I want to bring Brian in, but I just want to make sure that we're that's the way we're thinking about that question. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I was going to say we didn't include this in the wording of the recommendations because we thought it'd be good to have this conversation. But I think we were imagining that this would be an optional offering, the decision supporting tool. The question of we can have the conversation for each of the three components, but that I guess getting a yes or no on whether it's optional or required would help to answer the question of whether a veterinarian who has no interest or time to go through this process, that might make that a moot consideration in a positive way. But so yeah, this being an optional offering is something that we could be more specific about in the recommendation if that's the direction folks want to go in, which I think it was.
Yeah, I think so too, but let's we can add that kind of explicit question in towards the end of this particular tool and then get clear on that language of optional versus mandatory. Jessica Dotter, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say kind of similar lines of that. I always saw this as being optional. I don't think that this is in any way something that should be like created as an additional step. This is just a resource made available so that those navigating, the difficult issues have it as a tool that they can use if they wish.
Yep. Thanks for that. Jade, jump in.
Yeah, I agree. The time constraints about making this required are worrisome. And I worry that if this is optional, we aren't actually addressing what we set out to do because people may not use it if they feel they don't have time. And then we're still just getting reports that maybe don't make sense. So I'm struggling a little bit with if it's optional, are we getting to the heart of what we're trying to achieve?
All right, I'm gonna do the Zach Morris timeout on the optional versus mandatory. Let's flesh we'll come back to that in a second. Let's get through the elements piece, and then based on the elements, let's have the conversation of because I think that's a great discussion. I think Jade, thanks, Ashley. I was like, who's this gonna land with? Who is anybody else here around the age of 40? All right. So let's keep I appreciate those, Jessica and Jade. I think that's great. Let's come back towards the end with that kind of key question of how we phrase this. So with that, and then with that in mind, Jennifer, appreciate your points about the usability, the ease of use based on different people's situations. It doesn't sound like there's any recommendations on anything additional in this first bullet point of language, but just want to make sure before we move on to the second bullet. All right, I'm going to move us on to the second bullet. So second bullet, the task force recommends developing an optional method to document their completion of the proposed tool. However, members urge this function be optional should a mandatory reporter not wish to have their personally identifying information collected. Brian, can you just give a quick 30-second reminder to folks of this was created out of which discussion, because we were struggling with, just give a little bit of context so people remember kind of where this came from.
Yeah, sure. So in the evident change decision supporting tool, which we heard from a speaker from that organization and looked at sort of a dummy website that we could play through. In those systems, somebody uses the tool, and then there's basically a time-stamped proof that you've done it. So some folks talked about wanting to be able to have that receipt to say, yes, I went through this tool and I made the decision to report or not to report based on that. They saw that as being a helpful way to sort of put off liability concerns. Again, for evident change in New Hampshire, the Attorney General released a memo saying that if you complete the tool and you have proof of that, then that would be fulfilling your legal obligation to report, whether or not an actual report is made. So that's something that could be linked to that. And then the second sentence within that bullet point is, on the flip side, some folks have concerns about like folks working with victims of sexual abuse or domestic violence, or for whom they don't want to broach their confidentiality, but still might find the decision supporting tool to be useful. Having an option that doesn't timestamp or record their participation in it could let them gain the benefits of having a better informed decision without the negatives of compromising the confidentiality.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that. Ashley, appreciate your vulnerability in the chat. Like, not sure what this means. So clearly we need to be a little bit more clear on what this would be. But I think hopefully Brian's kind of like level setting is like, that's the conversation we're having, is like, should there be a documentation piece of if this happened, because of all the reasons and concerns that folks listed. So I'm going to go Jay, then Jill, Roshan, and Michelle.
I think I'm going to hold my comment because it's not exactly to this based on what Brian just described.
Jade, love that growth. Thank you. Appreciate that. Jill, go ahead, jump in.
I'm in favor of as much transparency as possible, especially for a mandatory reporter. I think equity and transparency go hand in hand. And if you're a mandatory reporter and you're doing this tool and then it's not being documented, I'm wondering why. I mean, maybe we could talk about like a very specific domestic violence or sexual abuse issue where we want to protect an advocate, but also those folks can make a direct hotline call or do a consultation. And if we're going to hold people accountable, ourselves accountable, I wouldn't want it to be optional to, if you do the tool, to not end up leaving your information in it.
Okay, so you're in vote for yes, this. Yeah, okay. Roshan, go ahead. Michelle, and then Carlos.
I think some of this probably came from my comments last time, because I was again, I think if we take DB&SA advocates out of mandatory reporting, I feel less concerned about this. But as a DB advocate, if I'm working with a client who has fled from one county to another, having the report in a county could disclose location. Like there's a lot of pieces of a report and then adding this tool that could, I'm not so much worried about my safety, although some advocates do worry about that, because if their name goes into a report, it could go into public spaces and an abuser could find the advocate as well. I'm thinking about the confidentiality that the advocate has. And also so anyhow, I had said that last time and I stick by that. I do think it's important, and I would be uncomfortable if we didn't leave it optional. But also I want to go back, Donna, to your point about equity, because I'm in other conversations around this right now. And there's a lot of emphasis in some of those conversations about identifying patterns over time. And part of what I'm thinking about too is like, how many paper trails do we want to create? I understand that sometimes it's helpful to go back and say there were 15 calls to the police or there were 10 mandatory, there were 10 reports made. But especially when we're thinking about communities of color or queer families that are over-reported, the more documentation we make of people's concerns that are not actually accurate or that are unfounded, it creates opportunity, I think, for that to be misused as well. So I just have a lot of feelings about it needing to protect certain communities, but also, again, I think because we're not talking about who's a mandatory reporter yet, it makes this part of the conversation a little bit more complicated, because I absolutely see how transparency is important in some cases. And I also feel like there's ways that transparency can harm a survivor. So it's hard to say.
Yeah, and Roshan, I think, Brian, I'm going to lean on you a little bit for this one, but my understanding is that this tool is not about it. This tool is really to protect the potential reporter and having a receipt of them having completed this tool. This is not tied into how many reports have been made, against a specific. This is really about the reporter, less about who they're, right, that they went through this tool. And so like Brian, your example of and I think this came from a previous meeting, the example of oh my gosh, why can't I think of the word? Like prosecution, that the reporter would say, well, I used this tool right? And I did this with Fidelity, and here's the receipt of me using this tool, and this is why I did not report, or this is why I did report. And that's the point of this tool. So Roshane, I think that your piece there would come from, like, when a report is made, the repository of that report itself, but this tool, I would not connect to that. So that's maybe the difference I'm seeing.
Maybe we need to clarify then where this tool lives and who can access it later. And
yeah, exactly.
I mean, I think we can say that that's how it would be used here. I don't know that we can guarantee that that's how it would be used once it goes out into the system. So just making sure that it is, I'm totally in support of the opportunity for reporters to think about it and have this tool. Like, I get that.
Got it.
I just want to make sure we're not creating another like cache of data that could then be drawn on in ways that might hurt folks.
Okay, that's super helpful. That's super helpful. So just more explicit language of what this tool is and what this tool is not, I think, is kind of what I'm hearing from them.
It's a little hard for me to imagine that we could access it when we needed it, but it wouldn't be accessed when we don't want it. Like that. I don't know that that's kind of a hard systems thing to say. Like, it's going to sit, and when we need it to prove we did it, it'll be there. So maybe I just don't understand how that could work. But if we can figure that out, I would be in favor.
Yeah, and I'm seeing some notes in the chat too. I think, one of our key questions is like, is the receipt here just for the individual, or is the receipt going to some central, repository, for lack of a better word? And so maybe it's that this group is saying no central repository, but we do want to create receipts for individual reporters, and that is truly just going to the individual. So I'm kind of hearing that from yours, and Don, it looks like you agree too. So let's chat about that as kind of the differentiator here. Michelle, are you?
Oh, sorry, I did not hear you say my name.
Oh, you're good. I was like, uh-oh, she fell asleep.
No, I'm here.
Okay.
I just want to reiterate, I think unless we change the statute around how mandatory reporters are being held accountable or will be held accountable for failing to make a report, I think we have an obligation to pay attention to the protection of those mandatory reporters, that if they use this tool and it screens them away from making a report, that they need to be able to have proof, because we know, and I know, Jessica had shared with us data about how often folks are charged criminally for failing to report, but it is the reality that somebody wants people held accountable. People want accountability when a child is left unsafe and a report is not made, and that they knew about it and didn't do anything about it. And so I believe that people would use this tool, and there still would be the likelihood that something down the road would happen, or something would go on to happen, and they would say, did you or did you not make a report? They say, I used the tool told me not to. They would need to have proof of that. And so unless we change the statute, I think we have to have proof for them that they did the tool.
So Michelle, with that point, are you comfortable with the receipts being just individualized for an individual to draw upon, or are you saying that it has to be in a central repository?
No, I think a receipt is fine. And, paying attention to what Roshane said, like, I also understand about, wanting to protect mandatory reporters from retaliation, or, putting victims in danger, things like that. So I don't know if there could be some assigned code, like, it doesn't have their name, but there's some sort of a code associated to them as a mandated reporter that they're given maybe upon completing the training. I'm always think about how to protect that their names are not listed. I don't know, but yes, I think a receipt is fine. And I think there's other ways that we can be creative to protect those who are in dangerous situations that puts them or their victims in danger from, again, retaliation or finding them or whatever.
Okay, perfect. And Jennifer, I see your note in the chat. I don't think the way I'm not seeing this as people expecting people to prove they used it. It's more that it's an additional tool for folks should they need to prove that they used it. So if they use the tool to say that they used it or not, or sorry, that they decided to report or not, that this is just a supplementary helpful thing for them to have the receipt. It's not that we then expect them to prove that
but I think we're going to create that kind of circumstance, like Michelle was saying. If there is a tool and somebody is being questioned about why they didn't make a report, their failure to use the tool or have proof that they did this process, I could see where that could really work against someone. So I think It's really important that we are clear about what first of all, like we've said, is this mandatory? Is this optional? How are we going to address that?
Which we're coming back to. We're coming back to.
Yeah, right. But then I think, there's also this piece of, is use of the tool or not use of the tool some kind of piece of evidence that, could bite somebody in the ass one way or the other.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks for spelling that out. Carlos, then Jessica, and then I wanna move us along on our points. Go ahead, Carlos.
Ida also has her hand up. It's sort of
sorry,
blending
Ida.
into the corner.
Blending in with your painting. Okay. All right, go ahead, Carlos.
I like what Michelle had to say. Those are good points. I assume the form's going to have some type of disclaimer box saying, I understand that, these, this is only a tool and you need to obviously fulfill your mandatory reporting requirements, and that box would have to be checked to maybe help with that liability portion of it. But maybe this is farther down the road. I also like that somehow there's documentation or some type of database showing that this tool is being used. And so we're getting some type of feedback, or we're able to go and look and say, okay, this is actually really helpful, or this tool is not being used, no one's ever reading it, or if we need to make changes to that form down the road, there has to be just some type of record keeping.
Some type of feedback
collection.
Okay. Yeah, appreciate that, Carlos. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off if you were continuing. Was that?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. I appreciate that. I think if the online portion of this obviously would be easier to track, which is actually a good segue into our next bullet, which is around there being a paper option and then how that is utilized. But appreciate that, Carlos, and we can tag that. Jessica Daughter, then Ida, then let's go to the next bullet.
Thanks, Trace. So I feel a little bit like we're getting a little bit in the weeds with this stuff, to be honest. Yep. When we practically think of like I said, I'm using the evident change as kind of my example. There is absolutely no inputting anybody's information in terms of a family's information or anything like that. So I have absolutely zero concerns from a legal standpoint as a lawyer about breaching confidentiality or anything like that. I think this is the exact kind of equivalent as if you were to go to a website, and say, go to the, CPO website and look up resources for should I report in a decision tree or whatnot. So I just want to be I think we get kind of in the clouds about these concerns, but we got to think about the practical use of this would be, you go on a website, you say, I want to use this tool, you start clicking on the boxes and it leads you to, recommendations at the end. I do agree that there should be then an option to say, would you like your basically use of this tool, receipt emailed to you? And that way they can choose to do that. I will say in regards to the conversation about whether there should or should not be a central repository, that's not really a choice. I mean, there will be a way for law enforcement to get a search warrant to say, I want to see and search, I'm going to go to the custodian of this website and I'm going to send a search warrant to their company. And I'm going to say, I want you to review from this time period to time period, any emails, receipts sent to this particular email, if that's my subject. So I just want to be very open and honest. I'm not trying to scare people, but I'm pretty sure that we'd be able to get access about that, whether or not we dictated a central repository of receipts. It would just be inherent in the record keeping of that company and in how their data would work. And I think that's fair. I mean, we have to remember that that's how it is for almost anything. If we want to look up that somebody searched on the internet for this tool, I could do a warrant, right? And say, I want to see whether or not their web history has the use of this tool in it. And then to that kind of, so I just want to be very open and honest and provide that information with the reality of how that information could be stored and how it could be accessed. I also do think that kind of finally, I think Jennifer was making the point about, shoot, it's escaping my mind, but I think it was about, shoot, it left. It just like flew away. Oh, I hate that. Okay, I'll put it back in the chat when I think about it. But anyways, I hope that helps, like with this.
No, it's super helpful. Yeah, super helpful. And you're exactly, that's kind of where I was like, all right, you got 2 more comments and we're moving on. I think the thing is what we're capturing again, this is not the implementation side. This is the recommendation that this tool has created. We will put the language in there of the values piece that people just named. Roshan, your piece around confidentiality, the option to be able to like, you know, Don, your piece around option to print screen, those sorts of things. Those will be fleshed out on the implementation side, but we can put language in at a high enough level to say that it is critically important that this is not used against someone, right? That this is just seen as a tool for the reporter themselves to be able to say that they went through this tool, that was the intention here behind the task force. So just want to clarify.
I remembered, Trace. Can I add?
All right. It's going to be good. I believe it.
I'm so sorry. I think it is relevant. So it was the concern about, is it going to be used against them if it's optional that they didn't use it? And I will say, like, from when I've worked on these cases, what I've done is like, I'll go say, okay, I want to look through the employment and training records. Was this person trained on mandatory reporting? How were they trained? What was the extent of it? If they weren't trained on this tool or they didn't know it existed, we're not really going to be able to use that against them, right? If they were trained on it and they didn't use it, now that's an avenue. I'll agree. So I just wanted to kind of respond to that.
Yeah, appreciate that. And Kathy, I see your point too around a third party like Evident Change certainly worked through a lot of these questions. And so I think that's also the benefit on, you know, that's the analysis piece of that third party versus the Nimble group of, you know, there's folks that have worked through this in a variety of states. And so could we draw on that expertise there? Ida, and then that's it. And then we're moving on to the next one. You're on mute.
Shoot. This mirrors a little bit about what Carlos was saying, but I want to turn our attention back to equity, and recognize that if we're going to be collecting data in this tool, which we should, that we are putting in a bid that the tool collects data on equity in the decision making that's happening. That we should be able to look and see how this tool is being used and to make some decisions related to equity about whether or not it's hitting the mark of a more equitable process at screening.
Yeah. Okay. Appreciate that, Ida. And I think that's something that I felt like I heard from Evident Change too, as far as like the way that they'd collect data to see like the impacts of how it helped drive or steer. So yeah, I think that's a good thing to kind of draw out. All right, I'm going to move us along. We are at time for this one. So let's get through these next pieces and make sure that we're capturing, generally speaking. The next piece, and I'm going to be a little bit more heavy-handed on moving us through. The next piece is that they're recommending a paper version of this tool also be developed so it's not dependent on internet access or technology, such as smartphones or computers. So again, not getting too in the weeds on implementation of exactly, you know, how to protect all the different pieces, because that let's assume that on the implementation side that will be true. We can name that as a value as far as like it is imperative that the identities, et cetera, you know, just like in all other systems when you call, et cetera, are maintained. But anything to add here as far as the paper recommendation piece? All right, moving us on. Recommendation that additional guidance be created to aid mandatory reporters in determining how and when to ask questions or in other ways engage with a family to determine responses to tool prompts and ultimately decide whether to report. Brian, that one is pretty wordy for me. Can you just give a little bit of voice to it to make sure that we're all on the same page?
Yeah, this is just responding to some of the conversation last week about questions. So yeah, this bullet point and the one after it are both about the mandatory reporter in order to answer some of these questions in the decision tool, like, is this circumstance happening? they might not have that information yet, but could go to the family or find other ways to try to investigate. So the question, this would be asking for more guidance on how those like follow-ups could happen without interfering with the investigation that might otherwise be going on. But just kind of addressing the uncertainty around that by asking the third party or the Nimble group or whoever to give some guidance on, you know, when is that appropriate? When should mandatory reporter try to learn a little bit more before making the decision on whether or not to make the report, just to help answer those questions.
Okay, Jennifer, go ahead.
I just think it's important that we acknowledge that for a lot of mandatory reporters, that is a paradigm shift, that, you know, we are taught you're not the investigator, you do not ask follow-up questions, you get the information that you were given, and you, if you have enough information to make a report, you make a report, do not ask follow-ups. That is certainly how we operate in victim services. So this would be a paradigm shift, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I just think we really need to name that if we are telling reporters that if we're going to train reporters, right? Like that's a whole piece of all of this conversation, that the shift, part of this is going to be that they're going to have more involvement in asking follow-up questions. I just think we should name that.
Thanks, Jennifer. Stephanie, can you, I just want to make sure I'm understanding I'm understanding your comment.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jennifer. It's a deep cultural change. And to me, it goes into what I would consider a training component. I would almost be ill at ease putting it on again, my perception of this tool is that it's a gut check, for lack of a better word, right? Like I've got 3 to 4 minutes to do this thing. I fill it out. It assists me, right? Apparently, you know, to do whatever I feel I need to do. And so I would just worry about putting something so deep into this particular tool. And I think it better belongs with the training subcommittee to really explore how would one go about changing the paradigm if in fact that's what's desired.
Yeah, does anybody have any, I'm seeing a lot of head nods and whatnot, so seems like that one's maybe more in the weeds here, and that we could, if we're determining kind of more higher level for the tool, that we could couch this kind of piece in the training piece like Stephanie's recommending. Roshan, jump in.
Y'all hear me? I think Sam's hand was up first.
Oh, I'm just going, Sam, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I'm traveling today, but I was just going to say, I strongly disagree. I think the point that we're really trying to get to is that you need to talk to families. You can't just make reports on them. And so to me, that's not in a training tool, that's in a decision-making tool that makes me stop and go, hold on, did I talk to the family enough to have the answers to these questions? That's how I think of it. If I don't have the answers to these questions, it's because I haven't talked enough to them. That's not the same as investigation, in my opinion. It's about the level of rapport and relationship.
Yeah, I think so. Agreed. I think what folks were saying is about like where that's spelled out, but I hear what you're saying is that it needs to be called out that this is a specific part of the tool. That part of the tool could recommend that you actually that you actually have a conversation with the family. So that's kind of what I'm hearing from you. Is that so maybe I think it's a little bit of both. It's like not getting so into the weeds of all the pieces, but it's naming it as an explicit, like this needs to be a part of the tool that to have the conversation with the family. Is that what I'm hearing from you, Sam?
Yeah, there needs to be something in the tool that's saying you don't have enough information, and what degree of information is relevant to get from a family versus relevant to get from a true investigation.
Got it. Okay, appreciate that. Roshan?
Yeah, I think I was going to say something similar. I think the clarity that we're not actually asking people to investigate and identify if they're, and do that work, but we are encouraging that people are partnering with in dialogue and trying to resource and support families. And there's just a line there that feels like this language maybe pushes people into thinking they have to investigate. And so we just want to clarify that.
Got it. All right, that's super helpful. Okay, I'm going to move us on. And I think that actually captures those two bullets with the meaningful engagement. We kind of like crossed over into both of those. So we'll just make sure we shift language as suggested there. So then jumping down, I think this one's pretty straightforward. Recommend that when developing the decision supporting tool, consideration be given to how it can and will interact with other tools already in existence, such as Colorado safety and risk assessment tools. So just being mindful, not trying to recreate the wheel, but seeing this as an additional support tool for mandatory reporters. I'm going to keep us moving. Drop anything in the chat if you feel like language-wise we need to clarify differently, but that's kind of the essence of that piece. Second to last one, the task force recommends that training for the proper completion of this tool be developed and required. I want to make sure that we're clear on when we say required here, because I know that some people might read that as requiring the tool versus requiring that if you use the tool, you have to have been trained in the tool. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding this recommendation just based on the conversations we've already had. So Brian, the language as it's written here is not that the tool is a requirement, but that the folks that would have access to the tool are required to complete training. Can we just clarify that?
Yeah, and just the bullet point is to open up conversation to whether, the appropriateness level of requirements. But just, I think there were concerns with people, looking at a tool that would be new to folks who are using it on just wanting to make sure there's both that it's intuitive to use, but there's also explicit instructions on how to use it. So we're just acknowledging that training on how to use the tool would be an important consideration for, the group that's making this tool to be sure to include.
Okay, so that, and I think that lends itself to the conversation, and which we'll have in just a second, around if this is mandatory or not, because if it's not a mandatory tool, then requiring training for folks that might or might not use it, right? I'm wondering where that fits in. So maybe it's it's embedded in the tool that when you begin to use the tool, there's actually a training on how to use it, like something that you watch before you actually use the tool, that you don't just like open the tool up. I could see something like that, because if the tool is just widely available, because it's not required, but it's widely available to anyone that might be reporting, that then there's the training element built into it as the tool, maybe is how we can.
Yeah, and like Jessica points out, in the evident change example, they had that built in. I know there was also conversation last week, I think, about like maybe each institution could have one person in particular who was, read up on how to complete the tool, or to give advice on how to complete the tool. But just, there's a number of ways that this bullet point as a consideration could be taken forward.
Okay. All right. Perfect. All right. I think I'm just trying to get ahead of what I think people would be saying, which is like, well, wait, is this saying it's required? Okay, cool. So we can be more specific in that language. And then the last piece here, the task force recommends that special consideration be given in developing resources and tools specific to sexual abuse. So, Jennifer, I want to make sure, let's just come off real quick. Are we missing any other specific call outs? I know the DV piece is one that is there anything in addition to that we're missing as far as specific training around these particular situations?
I think if this is going to include the issues that I see in my work, it's DV, it's stalking, it's human trafficking. Rashan, is there anything else you want to add here?
I think those three are the ones that we're usually thinking the most about: DVSA and human trafficking, stalking. It's 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, we'll capture that.
And I don't know if it needs to say this specifically here, but I just want to name that it's sort of and their impact on children piece. Because often what we see in DV is, for folks who aren't trained, the fact that a child is in a home where there is domestic violence is automatically child abuse. And putting aside whether advocates will be mandatory reporters when all is said and done, like there are a lot of other reporters who might have that information and might make a report. So there really has to be some nuance to that as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Appreciate that. All right, I'm going to Jessica Daughter. Then I want to move us on, and we're going to have to circle back around the mandatory piece at a different time. But Jessica, go ahead, and then I'll hand it over to you, Doris, to move us into the next one.
Trying to unmute. Okay, sorry, I threw it into the chat, but I do think child physical abuse is one of those other ones that kind of requires whoever's creating the tool, right, to have some of that expertise too, just because of like the types of injuries and what, you know, is normal versus what's not, blah, blah, blah. So just adding that.
Great, thanks. I would like to move us along by doing a quick poll. So Jessica, put your virtual hand down. Just curious, this will just give us a quick gauge. Again, this is not a vote, this is not like a formal vote. This is just us understanding. So a tool like this, as discussed, again, with the recommended changes that folks outlined and the need to kind of clarify and on the pieces that you all named, assuming that is all true and that folks feel good there. I would love to do just a quick informal poll of the piece of whether this is an optional tool or a required tool as part of the mandatory reporting process. So let's optional piece. If you are in favor of this being an optional tool to support mandatory reporters, though not required as part of the reporting process, can you raise, and don't do the thumb up goes away. So can you do the raise hand feature, because that's going to stay and we can make a record of that. And let's give it a minute. Again, this is the optional, asking that this be an optional supplementary tool for mandatory reporters. All right, I'm just going to ask that, Addie, that you're collecting these on the back end, just so we kind of know where folks are at. Give it about 10 more seconds. Seeing 19 members. All right, go ahead and lower your hands. If you would prefer that this type of tool once be required as part of the mandatory reporting process, that all folks would be required to go through a tool like this, can you please raise your hand?
Hey, Trace, while folks are voting, can I seize the opportunity to try and get caught up since I haven't read the materials either? Is this, if they use it, if it's optional or mandatory and they use it and they listen to the recommendation and that is not to report, are they then absolved of liability under that scenario?
I think of the dissolved of liability as a much bigger question that we didn't dive into. The question that we dived into is that people would like for folks to have individual receipts as part of any sort of liability issues.
Like evidence that they were told.
Yeah, evidence that they were told. So that's kind of where the conversation was. I think obviously the complete absolvement is not in the control of this group at this point, that doesn't exist, but that folks wanted
that could be a recommendation. It's not on the radar. Is that what you're saying?
Not a recommendation at this point, no. All right, so let me just make sure I'm capturing this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And make sure you get the names on those, and then y'all can lower your hand. Okay, I've put us in a pickle, Doris. I'm gonna move on to you, time-wise. And if there are folks on the call that are members of the public that want to provide public comment, send me a note now in the chat so that I know. As of right now, I haven't heard of anything. So Doris, we can take the full remaining time. All right, so we're gonna move on to consultations.
Awesome, thank you, Trace. So we asked you to have your documents up front, so you can see them. I will read them, just so that, for those of you who are more auditory, you have that as well. I'm trying to move my stupid. I have the little box thing that gives you options to do that wasn't moving out of the way, so it was covering up what I could see. So for consultations, the recommendation would be to enact policies that implement the offering of a consultation model to aid mandatory reporters in choosing whether a concern meets the threshold requiring a report to the hotline. And the key considerations that we have listed here that we want to talk through include the following. The first is the task force recommends locating this consultation service in a central statewide system rather than in county or institution specific offices in order to ensure formal consistency and widespread access. So want to get your thoughts and reflections on that consideration, and then we'll move us along. I'm also going to put it in the chat for those of you who, may have more difficulty accessing your document. All right, seeing no hands pop up. We might move through these really quickly. Okay, then the second consideration is that the task force recommends the consultation service be staffed by child welfare or public health individuals with specialized knowledge regarding abuse and neglect reporting. All right, now I see some hands. Jade?
I'm just wondering if we want to say professionals with experience instead of specify child welfare or public health, because there could be lots of different ways that people identify that still have this specialized experience or expertise.
Thank you, Jade. Jennifer?
I think we want to reflect some of the same things that we have in the bullets about the tool, the conversation we had about equity, the conversation about domestic violence, sexual abuse, etc., that we ensure that the folks that are responding to those calls have all of that, or that there are people available with that expertise. So maybe there's a DV expert, maybe there's, not somebody that has to know everything, but that it's a group of people with varied expertise.
I want to come back to that question, Jennifer, because I think that, as you think about the sort of the team of folks that would be staffing this consultation service, and, maybe we list out some of the specific expertise that you want included. So I heard domestic violence. What else are you thinking in terms of specific experience and expertise to include in that whole team?
I think we reflect back to what we put in for the tool so that it is equity and implicit bias, it's domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, human trafficking. I know we added child physical abuse, that all of those areas are captured here.
Thank you, Jennifer. Kathy?
Yeah, and I would add emotional abuse, and I would add medical child abuse or Munchausen by proxy, which the old term, because I actually just wanted to extend some support to, I think this is where we could be really, really innovative, right? Because I think that the information oftentimes needed at that point of understanding if this is a concern or not, I think is enhanced by that level of knowledge. And I think it was brought up earlier. So for example, many people may not understand that a bruise on a 2-month-old baby is substantially concerning, right? It may not feel like a big deal, and someone who doesn't maybe understand child development or understand sentinel injuries might not realize that's a big deal. On the contrary, someone might not realize that, and I'm just giving physical abuse examples, but a certain kind of fracture in the lower leg of a younger child that is mobile, called a toddler's fracture, is not concerning for abuse. And so in my experience, oftentimes even child welfare workers don't necessarily have that level of knowledge or distinction, not their fault. But we can tap into experts and professionals. So I like Jade's comment about saying professionals. And then I really think that there could be a way that, depending upon what the concern or the allegation is, if it's sexual abuse versus emotional versus neglect versus physical abuse, those professionals could be helpful.
Thank you. Ashley, I see your note in the chat about, you know, one of the cautions about listing, you know, kind of individual specialties or individual kinds of classifications of abuse or neglect, that it, you know, it's either you list all of them in some people's mindset, or if you leave some out, there becomes questions about why you left some of those out. And then Gina, your comment about individuals with experience with ICWA. I think that's an important call out, particularly given our conversation about equity.
Scared me.
Jennifer, do you have your hand still up or? Okay.
This is
okay.
Yes, I got to get better about that today.
Yeah, no problem. What other, you know, questions, additions, refinements do folks have about this item? All right, so we're going to move on to, oh, okay. Done, and then Sam.
Sorry.
I was just getting ready to move on and you chimed in.
No, it takes
No
me
problem.
a minute to find it, right? So,
no problem.
So I just want to make sure that if they use this option because they want to make sure that they're doing the right thing, that there's some kind of documentation on that as well, right? Protecting, because in our case, they need something to show that they took steps.
Yeah, thank you, Don. I think for all of these, we'll have to, you know, sort of work through what are then the implications or documentation to support verification in the event that, you know, an incident occurs that wasn't reported. Sam?
I just wanted to name two things. One, my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, was other states also had people with lived experience were part of this consultation. So I think that's something for us to consider. And then I would love more around substance use and how that person who's helping with that consultation has a real understanding of that as well.
Thank you, Sam. So some additional categories and really thinking about the who, reconsidering the who, and having as a part of that consultation team individuals with lived experience. Thank you. Any other thoughts, reflections, additions, refinements on this item? All right, so I think it was 2 meetings ago. I didn't join that meeting, sadly. We heard a lot about Arapahoe County's model. And so for the considerations, you know, I love this theme on building what already exists. There's this recommendation or consideration around, you know, building in components of what has already been implemented in Arapahoe County. So I want to get your thoughts, reflections, and refinements on this particular item.
So for me again, oh, I should be raising my hand. I will wait in line. Sorry.
No worries, Michelle. Sam, do you still have your hand up? Or did you re-raise it?
Lower it.
Oh, okay, perfect. Kathy, then Ashley, then Michelle.
I think one of the things that I heard when Michelle presented this and that I thought was particularly compelling and I feel like should be called out specifically is the coaching component of it. So it was the fact that there is an opportunity to coach and educate, particularly around issues related to bias, culture, those sort of, so I just think that would be nice to call that out.
Thank you, Kathy. Ashley?
I'm still stuck on the weeds of the last one, Doris.
Okay.
I just, as you guys were all talking, I was thinking, man, the person who would staff this line is going to have to be a PhD with 20 years of experience in 6 different fields who also has lived experience. Like that is impossible. And so it makes me think perhaps when we think about this consultation, it should be more several professionals who have differing experience, like somebody with lived experience paired with somebody with child welfare experience paired, you know, so I'm thinking like maybe not as big as a red team, but maybe this consultation should be a panel, or I don't know. We don't have to get into the specifics, but I really am concerned if our recommendation goes down the path we were just on, it's just impossible. So as far as this recommendation, I just think it's always a good idea to build on something that's already been developed and instead of starting from scratch. So I am definitely in favor of this one.
Thank you, Ashley. And so what I heard in folks sort of lifting up some of the areas of specialty was that the desire would be to have a multidisciplinary, multi-lens team that has included in the whole team expertise in a number of areas. And so just thinking about, you know, making sure that that team includes someone or some folks with lived experience, some folks who have really deep understanding of physical abuse and, you know, gradations different depending on the child age and what's presented, someone who specializes in sexual abuse and sort of the nuance there and substance use disorders. So I heard multidisciplinary team, but that is not explicit currently in the recommendation. So I love folks calling out what are some of those areas of expertise and perspective that should be included in that team. Michelle?
Yeah, I guess I have questions on both pieces. The team, is that a state level team? And like, how does that build in if we're all calling to the state and it goes to a panel, you know, like Safe to Tell, or I'm sorry, the hotline now gets overwhelmed. So I'm worried about capacity and responsiveness. And I guess that's another one of our issues is how quickly we're supposed to report. Right now it says immediately. Also want to caution against what they're doing in Arapahoe is incredible, but duplicating a mandate to duplicate that in our rural communities, particularly, we just need to be thoughtful around dollars and workforce and all of those things in terms of creating expectations that that would happen everywhere. It absolutely should. So let's just be really thoughtful about how that recommendation is crafted to ensure that the state also provides capacity to make sure that rurals can do it.
Thank you, Michelle. I think those are really important considerations for implementation. And so there is the consideration in this section around having the service located in some kind of centralized statewide system, I think yet to be determined exactly, you know, sort of where and who, and, you know, but a specific, you know, making sure that it is accessible to all communities. And I think some of the concerns that you raised, Michelle, would be very important considerations in where it's located, who staffs it, making sure that it's adequately resourced so that folks can respond quickly, I think are really important considerations. Thank you. And then Kathy, I see your note in the chat about along with Jade's around, you know, some you know, making sure that there's the use of some standardized protocol or tool that helps to streamline the process and you know, can also be used in an evaluation component. Jessica, you want to come off mute and share what you just put in the chat?
Yeah, I'll do that. I was just kind of speaking overall and somewhat to Ashley's point of, and I think I'm one of the people who was like, I tend to stay out of the weeds. And I want to point out that when we're making this report, right, we're making these recommendations to the legislature. In my opinion, some of the best receipts of, or like the most receptive recommendations and reports that I've reviewed are guidances, right? They're not completely prescribing what to do or what not to do in every instance, because the legislature is going to need to work that out, right, on an even bigger scale. And we have a lot of credibility because of all of the expertise in this room to guide them. But if we create this kind of unrealistic, like, it's got to be this and 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 this, it's a little like, well, that doesn't exist. And maybe it should exist, but we want to give the, kind of a reachable goal and a reachable mission to the legislature. And I just think that it's received better. And I just want to point that out kind of as we're talking through this, every stakeholder could come in and say, I want this expertise, I want this. And then we've got 50 pieces. And we need to be, I think, really cautious about, how we want to message that. And the better way to do it is to encourage all expertise, but be wary of kind of how far that goes.
Thank you, Jessica. Donna?
So as a person that worked at the National Conference of State Legislatures, I will tell you that legislators are always asking for specifics. So if there is a way that we can give an umbrella and then give some and also consider and list those things that she referred to as this and this and this and this, they're going to ask for some specificity. They always do, because it's outside of their wheelhouse. And so we got to figure out a way to have that be a both and, not an either or, because if we water this down too much, they're not going to have any idea of what we're talking about.
Thank you, Donna. Yeah, so I think that there's this balancing act in providing a level of that is like sort of like headline level, that's kind of a framework, but then also enough guidance so that there's meat that the legislature has to include in any legislative package. Thank you. Any other thoughts, reflections, refinements on incorporating components of Arapahoe County's model? Awesome. Okay, so the last consideration that we have here is a recommendation that consultation services be offered as an optional service for mandatory reporters rather than being required before every report is made. So this dovetails with the conversation that we had in the prior section around the decision support tools, grappling with this optional, not mandatory, given that mandatory reporters are not all the same. They don't all have the same capacity and time to go through this additional process before then making a report. So I want to get your thoughts, feedback, and refinements on this particular consideration before we open the floor for any additional considerations and then transition into warm lines. Giving folks another second or so to find their raised hand icon or come off mute.
Doris, I'm just curious what our thought is, because we have a lot of things that are sort of named or called out as optional. I guess what I'm wrestling with is, how do we then track the effectiveness and use of all of these optional things that we put in place? How do we know that the optional things are having the intended impact that we are set out to do? If all of our, if part of the majority of our recommendations are all, if a mandatory reporter chooses to utilize this, it's available. How do we maximize impact on a bunch of optional choices? And I'm not asking you specifically, I'm just throwing it out there. That's given me a lot of pause.
Yeah, so I thought that question was for the broader group, and I will share, maybe inappropriately so as a facilitator, but I will share that one of the things that gives me pause is, to your point, when we think about equitable impact, if all of these approaches are in fact optional, the reality is that people will sometimes exercise the use of one of these tools in biased ways. And so if there is the potential for, sort of going through this additional litmus test, it's more likely going to be exercised, frankly, for white families than for families of color. The default position for families of color is going to be reported. And where there is an opportunity to exempt out reporting, it's going to be done so in biased ways, because that is, frankly, the default. So sort of playing that back for the group as you think about and continue to grapple with a more equitable approach to mandatory reporting, want to repose this question around optional versus mandatory, and will offer that perhaps it is, that a mandatory reporter, one should be trained on, or shall be trained on all of these options or approaches, and maybe there is some consideration for the mandatory reporting choosing, having to choose one of these options before making a report. So it doesn't need to be that they have to do all of these things, but consider the extent to which there is a new process for reporting that includes the use of some disruptor, something that helps to refine decision making before a report is actually made. Jennifer?
I think there's another layer to that too, which is the reporter still has the option to report, even if the tool or the consultation leads them to, you don't need to report in this situation. They could still say, yeah, but I'm really uncomfortable with this and I'm going to make a report. So I think that implicit bias piece is going to be there either way. So we kind of have to back up to training, and right, like this is going to happen at every step of the process. Or do we, and I'm not recommending this, I'm just going to say, do we say you must follow then, the outcome of the tool or the recommendation of the person you're consulting with, or something to that effect.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I added in the chat, I see a couple of you reading just, something, food for thought. On the backside of making a report, there could be a new question around from the hotline on whether or not a tool was used to inform whether or not to make the report, and if so, what tool. So to some of the questions around just, how do you know that a tool is used or whatever, if it happens sort of on the side, there could be another question to get at whether or not a tool was used to get a sense of whether and to what extent mandatory reporters are using these tools to make reports. Yeah, I think good point, Donna. Well, both points. And I think also just referencing back to the tools have to be designed in such a way that they are explicitly designed to disrupt bias in reporting. And then Crystal, I appreciate your comments in the chat as well on, these being decision support tools or mechanisms, certainly may need to require training on them so that folks know the full array of options available to them before they make a report. And then, also this concern around making, if these support tools were made mandatory, then what implications that decision would have on capacity. Roshan, I saw your hand up, I thought, and then it went down. Is that right?
Yeah, I just keep coming back to this funding question, and I feel like there's a way in which when we say things like mandatory or we have an equity tool, like I guess it feels like I think it can create a false sense of security that like, but again, if we don't have the right training and we don't have the right funding, then it doesn't really matter, even if the tools are perfect, which we know they won't be because there's no way to create a perfect tool. So I think we just always need to be assuming that there's going to be fault in the system, and what are we doing to protect as much as possible? So I just appreciate, Donna, your kind of calling us back into it over and over with the assumption that it will be there. The bias will be there. We will not drum it out of the system in this conversation. So what are the ways that we can continue to do better and better and better in protecting? Because I think it's more dangerous when we create a false sense of security. Like we've managed it, we've done it, that's actually worse for families.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, it's like, okay, so this is the end all be all. Okay, now the system is going to be equitable and just and not racist, all the things, right? It's like there has not yet been, and likely in our near term will not be, a tool that solves for all of those things, right? So being very intentional and deliberate is really critical, and also continuously evaluating and evaluating impact and then adjusting as needed. We are that tool.
Well, the process is the tool too, right? Like the checking result, updating,
100%.
That process is the
tool. I mean us individually, right? Like if each person is manning their bias or checking their bias or knowing their bias, right? That's how that gets accounted for, in addition to policies, procedures, all of the things, right? It's that connection of all those things together.
Yeah, well, and I would add, and I know that we're a little bit on a tangent, but I would add that there is the opportunity to like slow down decision making in ways that can actually be disruptive of bias, right? So when you're asked to sort of check, like, what did you consider in thinking that this family should be reported? That can be a mechanism to disrupt bias, because people have to then, really think through, am I making this decision for all of the quote unquote right reasons? And so that can be a disruptor in and of itself, in addition to, doing the work for individuals to be more, intentionally mindful of the kinds of things that get reported. So I know that we are running short on time. Before handing it back to Trace on warm lines, I just want to pause and see if there are any additional considerations for consultation that folks have top of mind that we want to add to this list. And then we can transition to warm lines and wrap us up today. Margaret?
I just want to name that I bet I've gotten 3 calls in the last 10 days from educators asking for advice on to report or not to report. And this is happening informally, whether or not we do anything about it. And I just wanted to talk about that because it puts me in a high anxiety mode. And because I don't have access to the information that the educators have, my default is usually make a report and let people investigate this. And that may not be serving families. And I just think that having this opportunity would take the heat off people like us. And I know that many of us in this meeting are facing similar calls. So I just wanted to call that out.
Thank you, Margaret. Stephanie?
Yeah, first of all, Doris, I just really want to thank you for your comments. And I feel unresolved on this issue of optional versus not optional, right? I know that we did a poll on the first piece, right? The first tool, for lack of a better word. And I think we've gotten deeper into the discussion about optional versus not, and the benefits and drawbacks of that. So I just don't want to lose that point, because again, Donna's point is well taken. I don't want to lose it, and I think it, at least in my opinion, it feels like it needs to be either discussed or revisited.
Stephanie,
I don't know how my friends who were writing up all of this for the report could move forward on this point.
Can I just jump in real quick? I think, Doris, we could just do a poll because it came up for both of the first two subjects, just to get a pulse on folks. So required, not required, or sorry, liability versus not liability if you use the tool. And then we have an idea, and then we can decide how we want to revisit that.
So the question I think that folks are grappling with that came up with consultations doesn't sound like it's a liability, no liability question. It sounds like it's more about the burden that's on the mandatory reporter to either mandatorily use one of these tools or not before making a report.
Yeah, Doris, if I can just jump in, that's Trace. I'm hearing both. We want to do whether the consultation is a requirement that you have to go through consultation prior to making a report. And then I asked Trace just do a poll because we left, I think, Michelle Murphy, you raised a question about liability and if using these tools resolves that liability. And for planning purposes, wanted to come back to that question if this is a recommendation that this group wants to consider. So they're two different questions.
So here's what I recommend. I'm just looking at our time. I think we follow up via that and survey. We need to get super clear around what we're asking. We ask people to weigh in that way. So I think it's just gonna be really important for members to check your email, and we'll make sure that we're super crystal clear in the way that we're asking each of these questions that have been raised. And then we can decide from those survey results how we're going to move forward with that conversation. But I think Doris, if you don't mind, let's close the conversation for now to move on to the next topic so that we at least get some feedback on the Wormlines piece. So the recommendation side are kind of more baked out, and then we can do this surveys piece to kind of move forward as far as these bigger questions of liability, et cetera, and the things you named.
Yeah. Yep. I think that makes sense. Ashley had her hand up before you jumped in, Trace, so I want to call on her
Ashley
to wrap up this conversation,
I'm
and then
such
we'll
a
move to
troublemaker.
Wormlines.
Really?
Make it quick, Ashley.
I will. I mean, I just want to voice that I'm struggling a little bit with even when you are going to ask us to vote on mandatory and not mandatory, because I think, again, lawyer brain here, just the caveat that's always needed. You can make it voluntary, but in reality, as an attorney or a prosecutor, if it's best practices and somebody does it, that is always going to mitigate issues later in court. So you can make it not mandatory, but in reality, in court, I think it will mitigate things, whether you make it mandatory or not, whether you intentionally call out liability or not. So I'm just going to put that out there because I think it's a little more, it's just to really confuse things for you all.
Doris, any response? Okay. All right. No, it's helpful. I think it's helpful context for as we draft the questions and context we give folks. Okay, y'all. We're pivoting. There's no public comment that I've seen, so somebody speak up. I'm about to blow your minds with how we efficiently move through Wormlines recommendations. So I slimmed down the language, so don't look at the document right now. Look at what I put in the chat, just because I think it gets to the point a little quicker on the recommendation. Task Force recommends the creation of a Wormline system for families in need of assistance. This system will serve to connect families to services and resources when the concerns of a mandatory reporter for a family do not rise to the threshold requiring a report of suspected child abuse and/or neglect. Moving now back to the document to look at the subsequent points. Let me just get through all these, Jennifer, and then we can have a bigger conversation. The following considerations should be made in developing these policies. 1, in order to eliminate duplication of efforts and to build on resources and services that already exist, Task Force recommends contracting with a third party to create an inventory of existing resources. In the creation of that inventory, the third party shall consult families with lived experience with the mandatory reporting system. These perspectives should help the third party in compiling its list of resources and considering connection points, including learning how families connect with systems, for example, how technology is used or how information is received. Third party must also conduct outreach in every county. This outreach should include compiling, understanding challenges and strengths of each jurisdiction. The third party should also consider cultural, socioeconomic, and other social elements of each jurisdiction and gathering information on resources and available services and corresponding gaps. Continuing on with the third party, what we're recommending third party do must assist how the list of available resources remains current. So making sure this resource wasn't created once in 2024 and then 2064, we still are working with the same list. Third party must contact United Way, 211, and other organizations doing similar work. I imagine some of you are doing similar work, so that will be helpful to flesh out that list. Third party must consult with its similar existing networks. See pages 12 to 13 here. In other states to learn about their various processes, implementation, funding structures, and lessons learned. So again, this is happening in other areas and including those as bright spots in how we roll this out. Also present recommendations on how best to build on those inventoried entities to develop a warm line system. Okay, so those are all the considerations that would be asking of a third-party system in creating this warm line. So I want to, what are we missing? What do you want to like refine? Jennifer.
My issue is actually with like the second sentence of the recommendation, which assumes that a family needs resources if a report is not appropriate. It might be that this is all bias-based, and when the tool or a consultation is done, a report doesn't need to be made, and the family is okay. There isn't any intervention, there isn't a need for a connection to other services. So I just want to make sure it says something like if appropriate or something to that effect in there.
Okay. That's, yeah, I think that's a, when it has been determined that assistance is needed or desired, something like that. What else would folks, I'm looking, this is one where I think the third party makes total sense. Just to close, thanks, Ashley. Yeah, I think this is a lift, right? It's like connecting the dots, consolidating where consolidation is possible, ensuring that folks understand what's out there, and also like making sure that that they're relevant. You know, like I like the piece about talking to people about how do you use technology? How do you connect with these resources? What do you like to use? What do you not like to use? Shauna, go ahead.
I think it's important to stress why this is not 211, right? That this is not simply a list of phone numbers that you're referring out to, that it includes coaching with families and staff that are going to coach using motivational interviewing skills, using a strength-based lens, that we spell out what difference that this provides that is different than we already have throughout Colorado.
Yeah, and I could see that maybe living up in the recommendation itself. You know, that we're creating a warm line system that goes beyond the current resources available, that takes more of a, I'm just spitballing, but more of an approach of, like you said, coaching, et cetera, walking alongside families and actually supporting and getting them to the resources in a meaningful way. And then all these supplemental bullet points. So appreciate that, Shauna. Is that kind of getting at what you're saying, where it's like, this isn't just another like, hey, call this number, they'll help. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Donna and then Jade.
And in the spirit of the social determinants of health, right? We're making sure that they're community-based. We're making sure that they're culturally specific so that people don't have to travel the highways and byways to access such resources, right? So we got to make sure we get that language baked into all of these recommendations. Otherwise, it's going to be an add-on and forgot about.
Yep. Appreciate that, Donna. Jade?
I think I'm just building off of Shauna's points, and maybe this is semantics, but I think the phrase inventory of resources, I really hear as like a resource list. And so I think it's just like, are there some different words to describe what we're talking about to really differentiate this from like what we're not asking a third party to put together a list of resources that exist in each judicial district. We're really asking them to help us understand how could a warm line system build off of what's existing in our state? How could it contribute to that? I don't know. That's where I'm a little stuck.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the word. I think that's totally fair, Jade. I think it's like hearing you and Shauna. It's like, how do we how do we in the recommendation language make sure that this again isn't just compiling a list? So I'm thinking of like a compilation of resources and almost like an assessment of the not the usage, but like they're doing like a landscape analysis, right? Of like what's working and what's not working, what's utilized and what's not utilized, not just like finding every nonprofit number out there that says that they help kids and families, you know? So I think that yeah, go ahead, Doris.
I do think that there would need to be someone who is gathering insights on services and supports that families, especially families in under-resourced areas and those who have different racial, ethnic, cultural backgrounds access, that might not be the formal services and supports that we think of. Like it could be more informal, because those are places where people feel like they, you know, they understand who they are and what they need. They're respected, and you know, so like cultural brokers or other kinds of services and supports, again, that are more informal, that right now are likely not captured in any kind of formal way. So when you think about the mechanisms for connecting families in need to alternative pathways outside of child welfare, outside of reporting to the hotline, they'll need to know like what is available to connect a family to. And I think particularly when we think about under-resourced communities, there might be some resources that they're accessing today that are just not known to the professionals.
Yep. All right, Roshan, then Shauna. You're on mute, Roshan. Wow, 3 people today.
All right, you're welcome. I keep thinking about money, and I want to be really careful that we are already stretched super thin and not funding resources across the state. And I think sometimes it's easy to get into a situation where we're like, oh, there's not enough resources, so we need to build a resource. I just want to make sure we're not, if this is meant to funnel folks into current resources and identify gaps, that feels really helpful to me. If we're trying to build like a statewide navigation system that's going to require like actual advocacy and support, I think we are doing ourselves a disservice. And we're doing current programs a disservice who are already competing for funding and struggling. So I just want to make sure we're thinking about like the scope here, that it's not meant to be like, and now you have an advocate that follows you, because we just don't have enough money in the system. I mean, I wish, but I don't want to think small. I want to think big, but I think we need to be realistic.
Yeah, and Roshan, I think the good news is that my understanding too is that it's the former. So I think maybe I'm just hearing kind of the call out for explicit.
Yeah, I just want to stay clear about that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, I think we can reflect that in language, what this is and what this is not. Shauna, 1 minute. Oh my gosh, bring it home.
I know that we're running out of time, and Roshan, I don't need to repeat things that you have already said. So thank you for that. I just want to call out that a warm line would be really helpful statewide, but really being able to drill down to what is already happening across the state, and that family resource centers are already defined in state statute as providing resource and referral and comprehensive coordinated care, which is that follow along service and support for families who want that. So we already have a lot of this throughout the state, and needing that kind of statewide system so everybody knows kind of where and how to access that would be great. So, but just how do we coordinate that? And then how do we call that out in this recommendation? So hopefully I did that, and we still have 30 seconds left.
Perfect. Amazing. No, I think that's great. I think the more intentional language around like the altitude of this sort of analysis and compilation is kind of what I'm hearing from you all, of like, it's not just a list. It's again, I'm coming back to the word analysis or assessment of current services, and making, again, it's like we work better together. And this is really in the spirit of efficiency of those systems and a lot of those supports that already exist. And Roshan, point well taken, that we're not trying to set up a competitive environment where we're creating yet another entity where folks have to like, Hunger Games themselves to dollars. So point well taken there. All right, with that, I think we've got some really great feedback on the warm lines piece that we can shape this up further. Last thing I'll say is we're going to send out that poll to you all with the language around the liability piece and the other piece that Doris talked about. We just need to get our heads together on the planning side and make sure that our language is super clear. So be on the lookout for that. Appreciate y'all jumping in today with the nice Katniss reference. Love it. Appreciate y'all jumping in today with the last minute resources and whatnot. But I think we got somewhere good today. So thank you all. And I'll end at 10:01, the latest I've ever been. I apologize. And we'll see you back in April. Take care.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks.